Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the FitBigStrong podcast. This is episode 8. If you're coming from the Two Dudes One Barbell podcast, sorry, it wasn't episode 9. This is episode 8, and today we'll be discussing the differences between performance and health. And I have a guest, my
Hello.
good friend John Black.
Hello.
Which is an awesome name.
No, thank you.
Very, very,
I didn't
very
get
exciting.
to choose it, but that's okay.
Luck of the draw.
Yeah, exactly. I just got given it.
That's it.
Yeah.
So, this is a bit of a part 2. So, we just did a whole discussion on the differences between performance and health for other modalities like body composition, strength, flexibility. And we thought we'd extend the podcast to nutrition and sleep.
Yeah, so last time we talked mainly about the fitness-related components or like the exercise-related components
Yes.
in terms of health.
Mm-hmm.
We call them health-related components of fitness.
Yeah.
And then now we're going to talk about nutrition from a base perspective, and then how that leads into performance and how it can detract from performance, and then we'll probably talk a little bit about sleep and
Well, people make sacrifices with sleep. Sometimes they'll be like, "Oh no, I'll cut down on my sleep so I can train." It's like, well, maybe, and we'll explore that. That's for sure.
yeah. I mean, do you want to? Well, where do you want to start? Do we start with nutrition and just health and health base?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Okay. So through the lifespan, nutritional demands will change, right?
Okay.
Surely,
Yeah.
right? Because we start off drinking milk, right, and then we transition into food, and then later on in life there are changes in demands, right?
Yeah.
But the fundamentals of that nutrition are going to stay the same, but just the amounts and how we get it are going to change. So
From a practical application,
yeah,
let's say you are 18, so you somehow made it through puberty.
yeah.
What is the general requirements for nutrition? So, for example, grams per kilogram or percentage of calories wise. Like the actual requirements for health are quite low. Like your bodily functions, etc.
Yeah, so the human body is pretty adaptable to multiple different ways of eating. And what is optimal is still probably being explored.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of genetic variation. But if we can talk about what the body typically needs, and we'll talk about essential nutrients versus non-essential nutrients.
Yeah.
These essential nutrients are the things that we would need to eat to maintain function and thus maintain health.
Yeah.
And they can be divvied up into macro and micronutrients. And most people are probably pretty familiar with macronutrients.
That's it. What should my macros be? I'm trying to gain weight.
Yeah, exactly. What should my macros be? And macros include carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Funnily enough, carbohydrate is not actually essential. Your body produces it, so we can regard that as a non-essential. But for most of us, carbohydrates is super useful because it's the fastest way we can get energy into the body.
Yeah.
And thus very, very useful for activity and exercise. The things that we like to do are usually fueled by carbohydrates.
That's right. Well, if you want to go for a hike and it's a relatively challenging hike, you're going to eat keto before that? I mean, maybe not.
Possibly.
Possibly.
What about those like hardcore dudes who like go go hunting? They go on a hike. They will just like fast.
Yeah.
Go, I don't know, kill a bear or something. Then they eat the bear, like they cook it, and that's full keto, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know my alter ego was going to make a presence on this podcast.
Oh,
but...
does your alter ego eat beer?
No, it was just a joke.
Oh, okay.
Well, maybe in a separate universe where I'm Russian.
Yeah, possibly. They eat beers in Russia? I think people do eat beer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was me just kind of trying to be silly, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, perhaps. I mean, fasting in Russia is only vodka. So then again, that is a bit of a different...
Fasting. Funnily enough that Ashton brings up alcohol, I didn't bring that into the conversation, but that could be regarded as another macronutrient because it does actually provide energy.
Yes.
And so we have energy yielding nutrients, which are the macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein and fat, and alcohol.
Yeah.
And then we need a certain percentage of them to facilitate bodily function.
That's right.
And then some of those nutrients also replace tissues within our body.
Okay.
Okay, and then what are the other nutrients, micronutrients? We have...
So you got like magnesium, zinc,
Yep.
the B vitamins,
Yeah, cool.
C vitamin, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we have vitamins and minerals, which are micronutrients, which we
Mm-hmm.
need. They're called micro because we need them in smaller amounts, and they don't provide any energy.
Okay.
But they help facilitate reactions within the body, and if we didn't eat them, reactions wouldn't happen.
They wouldn't happen.
They just wouldn't happen. So, like an example would be vitamin C. If you don't eat enough vitamin C, you cannot synthesize collagen, thus you get scurvy.
Yeah. It's interesting because when people supplement collagen, it's often complex with vitamin C.
That's very interesting. I wonder if you ate enough collagen, would you still get scurvy if you didn't have any vitamin C?
Wow. Maybe we'll start up a study in Russia to figure that
out. The funny thing is, and anyone who's in tune with their nutrition research knows that vitamin C has more than one function.
Yeah.
It helps synthesize carnitine. It helps. It's an antioxidant. It has a number of other functions.
Mm-hmm.
So you probably would notice.
Yeah.
Not having vitamin C, but I just the typical deficiency is
Scurvy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because different micronutrients are often associated with different functions. So if you like calcium is often associated with bone health. Iron is often associated with red blood cell count and
Correct.
things like that.
But they do more than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of, well, should we use calcium first, for example?
Yeah.
It's flooded into your muscles every time you contract them.
Yeah, that's the calcium pump.
Yeah, and your muscles will not contract without calcium.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, muscle function is you need calcium for muscle function. You also need calcium for a number of different enzyme functions.
Yeah.
Right. It's not only bone health.
Of course.
Yeah. And iron is also part of the electron transport chain, so it's needed to facilitate energy production.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
like they don't stop. They have their predominant use. But then they also have a number of other things
subset kind of things
that they're part of. So those micronutrients, and they're all part of different reactions.
Yeah.
And we need to have adequate amounts for the individual in order for us to maintain health and function.
Yeah.
And in some cases, some of those micronutrients might need to go up for performance, and in some cases, the macronutrients might need to go up for performance, or
Very
even go down. Right?
Go down.
I mean that's what you do, right?
Yeah.
For performance, you manipulate nutrition, you manipulate training variables, and then you see
Make
what
adjustments.
happens. You see what happens. You throw.
Yeah, that's right. So what happens? Oh, this worked. Oh, this didn't. Maybe we should give him some vitamin C again.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, it's interesting because like, how could we ensure that we are getting enough micronutrients or enough macronutrients? My general thought
For health.
Yeah, for health, because Dr. Mike Israel mentions roughly 30% of your calories from macronutrients actually constitutes what you need for health for general populations, like 10% from protein, carbohydrates, and fats. What are your thoughts on that metric?
Okay, so like, what would be the minimum viable macronutrient intake?
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty fair rule. However, and I understand where he's coming from. And then if you have macronutrients, usually micronutrients will slip in there.
Yeah.
But I think micronutrients need to be added to that benchmark.
Yeah.
So in most diets, I think a 10% rule is probably pretty cool. So what did Mike say? 10%?
10% for each macronutrient.
10%,
roughly.
and the other ones can be manipulated.
Yeah, and really the health aspect from the other 70% is purely source based. So what is the sources of those macronutrients?
The unfortunate thing is the only one that wouldn't work with is if we only had 10% carbohydrates, 10% fat, and the rest was protein.
Yeah, that'd be.
Then you'd probably die.
Because you just can't get the calories in, right?
You just wouldn't be physically. It would be hard to eat. And secondly, protein, unfortunately, even though it does yield energy, is very hard for our body to convert into energy. So if you have, you work in calories or kilojoules?
We'll use calories because that's the common lingo. We can make some conversions on the spot if we need to.
We'll go with calories. I'm okay with working calories, but
awesome.
I grew up in the metric system, so I use kilojoules.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we'll be using freedom units today.
Yeah, freedom units. So 4 calories for a
protein and carbohydrates.
Gram, for a gram on average. Right? It also depends on the actual amino acid. However, only 10% of your protein intake is ever used for energy output.
Wow.
So only 10% really,
it's ever. A very low contribution to energy.
So if you ate, 4,000 calories of protein, that's
Jesus
only
Christ.
400 calories.
Wow.
That you use.
That's crazy.
You starve.
Huh.
Right?
That's insane.
So you can see why I said I like the 10% metric, but he's really talking about variables between carbohydrates and fats for energy sources.
Yeah.
And then 10% as a minimum for
protein. And so the upper limits kind of change. And it's also practical. It's so difficult to eat just protein. And it's also so difficult to eat just fat. Like, have you tried, drink olive oil? Like, because you ran out of carbohydrates because you had too much avocado. It's interesting.
Yeah, carbohydrates are very easy to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is the upside of carbohydrates or a high carbohydrate diet. And the upside of eating fat is there's more energy in it per gram, so you don't have to eat as much.
Yeah, from a volume standpoint.
So there's trade-offs with even just the ease in which you eat carbohydrates and fats.
Yeah.
So that 10% I think is probably a pretty reasonable standpoint. So if we just step back and say, look, what does my diet look like? Do I have at least 10% of each of those 3 things?
Yeah.
You do, then you can say it probably sits within that health
spectrum,
right?
And I often think it's actually quite difficult to not get 10%. I feel like you have to actively try. Like, if you only ate fruit, maybe. But, if your maintenance is 2,000 calories, getting 200 calories worth of protein is so damn easy. Because you get it from all these other different little things.
Yeah.
And it's just based on the typical diet, which consists of balance, macronutrient-wise, we're set.
Yeah. I mean, fruit is the exception for, if you only ate fruit or you're only eating... If you're vegan, it could become difficult to get enough fat or protein in some cases.
Yeah.
But they will eat, I'm sure they all eat olive oil and that
sort
sort of thing.
They add olive oil and if you're trying to make a vegan burger, how many elements are there? Lots of fats and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so realistically, it's probably unlikely that anyone would ever drop under 10%. And 10% should be enough for the protein in terms of health, in terms of maintaining life.
Yeah,
how much excelling is not another thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how much protein turnover does your brain need? It's probably not as much as building muscle. So
no, definitely not. I'm very unlikely to do the same. I mean, your body's going to partition towards those other tissues before your muscle anyway. So the only you existing is going to be fine on 10%, but then when we start talking about health, it's probably more than just existing.
Yeah, that's right. Because you got the different organ functions and then quality of life, and so if you're eating so little protein that you're losing muscle and therefore you're too weak to open the door, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So perhaps increasing protein in that case, but it's, in my opinion, it's unlikely that would be at 10% of calories, that you would see that kind of degradation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would suspect at 10% protein you would see increased rates of illness.
Oh, you would?
Susceptibility to common infections and that sort of thing, because your immune function is going to be hampered by the amount of protein that you have.
Okay.
A lot of your signaling molecules in your T and B cells are all made up of protein.
Oh, okay.
So your immune system is heavily reliant on protein, and let's say it gets taxed, right, and you have to fight off some sort of infection, you're going to have to produce more of those proteins.
Oh, I see. But if you don't have that surplus of protein to upregulate it.
Exactly.
Ah.
So, and obviously your skin and other things require protein, but I think just the illness side is why I suggest higher amounts of protein than the minimum, which is 0.84 grams per kg of body mass for men and 0.75 grams per kg of body mass for women.
Interesting.
So that's the actual figures that are suggested by most countries around the world to prevent protein malnutrition.
Yeah.
But it's not going to stop you getting sick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, eating more protein doesn't ensure that you're not going to get sick, but it just means that I would suggest
when something happens,
you're probably going to bounce back better.
Yeah, look, I'm an advocate of a higher protein diet. Like, I'm not, even for health, and just and for other reasons of health like satiety, I'm a fan of high protein. I think
body composition is definitely something. Protein definitely helps with that. Yeah,
and I think the minimum. What I was trying to illustrate is that the minimum requirements are so hard to not meet.
Yeah,
like you have a steak and you're set basically, and even in regards to micronutrients. Obviously, we can break down every little detail, but that wouldn't be necessary. What are some ways we can kind of guarantee that we are reaching our minimum requirements? Are there like dietary practices or particular sources of food which cater towards meeting our micronutrient needs?
You're really setting me up for this one, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
is this a challenging question or
not really?
Oh god!
But you are setting me up to push what sort of foods I think are healthy, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so
that's the beauty of this discussion.
I suggest that people eat red meat. Reason I suggest people eat red meat is because not only does it cover your protein, it's probably going to cover a fair amount of your fat, and also it's got a very large spectrum of B vitamins, except for say maybe folate, which is B9. So pretty much all your B vitamins are covered. And then the vast majority of your minerals are covered except for maybe potassium and magnesium.
Nice.
So if you eat beef, you pretty much covered most of what you need.
Wow.
And I'm talking about muscle meat.
Yeah.
If you ate if you're weird like me and you eat liver, you're absolutely covered. You're
okay. Wow.
You're set.
How much beef? Like, is there roughly 200 grams, roughly 300 grams
per day?
Yeah, like if you could provide. I know that's a very difficult question, and if it's hard to answer,
that is a difficult question, and I think it would depend on the individual largely, and the amounts of beef that people eat is going to depend heavily on
a myriad of factors and cost as well for a lot of people. But including it in the diet is probably a good idea.
I would say so.
Nice.
I mean, if you had a meal of beef 3-4 times a week, that would be my minimum.
Okay, interesting.
But I mean, I have it every day.
Yeah. So you're like set.
Yeah. So
interesting.
But then you have other people that are scared, and this might be contrary to some people's exposure to what is healthy, and that people think red meat is unhealthy. There has been a fair amount of research which has largely debunked this theory, and I don't know why it persists, because it's pretty clear
maybe political
to me.
tension,
maybe political or whatever, but if we just look at it from a nutrient standpoint, without conflating biomarkers and that sort of thing, which a lot of these researchers look at, beef has the most nutrition of anything that you will probably eat, say maybe salmon. Yeah. Salmon is probably more nutritious than beef, but I'm not going to encourage people to buy salmon every day because
it's expensive.
It's actually way more expensive. And also, where did you get your salmon from?
Oh, interesting. So that does make a bit of a difference?
I think so.
I'm not familiar with this at all. So
it could be farmed, and what's in the water, and is that going to impact your health? I'm actually unclear as to where that line draws. The cool thing about us living in Australia is when we get beef, it's from Australia, and we know that there's standards for them to grow cattle correctly, and
so there's a huge high degree of standard. And so you're not going to potentially see increases in heavy metals
Yeah.
and all those potentials.
Exactly, and heavy metals are way more likely to occur within like an ocean dwelling fish, right?
Yeah.
Or like a water dwelling fish. Well, water fish are always in the water.
Well, what about a land dwelling fish?
Yeah.
He's got his like 9-to-5 job. He's just sick of it all.
So that's the reason why I would suggest beef, and obviously eggs are probably pretty nutritious as well, but that's probably more from a fat the nutrients within the actual yolk itself.
Okay.
So the protein is pretty nothing, like the protein
per
is,
egg.
Yeah, the protein is good, like but some people do have sensitivities to the protein, but we won't talk about that today. But in the yolk itself, it has a full spectrum of things that you would need. It's got vitamin A, it's got vitamin K, it's got vitamin E, it's got vitamin D, and then it's got choline, and it's like it's very rich in nutrient value. So there are certain foods that definitely have more yield for what you would eat.
Interesting. Because and then we could perhaps mention vegetables and things like that. Obviously it's clear that red meat is very dense in nutrients. And vegetables can be too. When you've also got to consider bioavailability and these kind of things. So if you were to mix a diet, what isn't high in nutrients, there's things like processed carbohydrates. And a lot of fast foods are relatively low in nutrition.
And the interesting thing is there's actually a place for processed foods, right? There's definitely a place, particularly for performance, which we haven't even really touched on yet.
No.
But in terms of carbohydrates, a more processed carbohydrate is going to be absorbed more readily, and it's going to be easier for you to use. So there's the sort of trade-offs there. It's like, I mean, how bad is the processed carbohydrate for you? Is it bad because it doesn't have any other nutrients in it? Or is it inherently bad because it affects your physiology?
I lean more on the low nutrient side of things.
So often people, there's definitely no discussion there in terms of it doesn't have any nutrients in it. I mean, white bread now is fortified in a number of different nutrients.
Iodine nowadays.
They put folate in bread.
I've seen one with calcium.
They fortify them full of stuff, and then obviously cereals are fortified in heaps of food. But these are really fast carbohydrates which can be utilized for performance, particularly something which is relatively glycolytic. So
we've clearly created a distinction between what's optimal for health and performance. Perhaps the carbohydrate load for performance is much higher to receive those performance benefits than what it is for health.
Correct.
So
I agree.
I generally like to recommend 2 times body weight for carbohydrates. Is like a really, really, really solid for performance.
That's really interesting. That's pretty much bang on what I would suggest.
Really?
Yeah.
Nice. Look, we actually haven't even discussed this.
No. Is that weird?
It's how funny is that? I like to take another step as well, is reducing. So you're kind of limited with calories, right? So you can only have so many calories. How do you structure your calorie intake for performance? Well, we know that protein, like there's associations with protein. More protein to a point yields better body composition and performance, recovery, etc. And then you got fats. My perspective is, beyond a point, increasing fats is not going to improve your endocrinology. There's a minimum amount of fat required for hormones and that side of things. Maybe that increases a little bit with athletes, but anything above that is just calories. And so when you compare carbohydrates, which directly impact performance, you want basically to get the amount of protein that is of highest threshold, and then the minimum amount of fats. Now you have a huge window of carbohydrates, or a huge amount of calories which you can fill with carbohydrates. That's how I structure my nutrition and macros for performance.
And that's in line with what most sports nutritionists will do. Right. And I think for most athletes, that makes a lot of sense. There will be exceptions to driving or fat loading, but not in most sports.
Well, I read an interesting paper where they were able to increase mitochondrial density by doing low intensity cardio in the absence of carbohydrates. They would stay faster than increase fats, and that actually causes a further increase in mitochondrial density.
Yeah,
which can be super cool, especially if you're like further in an off season.
Yeah, and for endurance, there's probably arguments for being able to increase your ability to metabolize fats and use fat as a fuel source, because we can store more fat. And let's say you're running 60, 80 kilometers. Are you going to rely on your energy gels the whole time? Like,
probably not.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously are going to use them, but like, being able to convert fat into energy is going to be super useful. But typically, the approach that Ashton described before is the ideal way to deal with most sports, unless you're like a stupid endurance sport. No, I'm not.
Yeah.
When I say stupid, I mean that in a nice way. I mean like
extreme
like
ends of scenario.
extreme endurance, right? Like long distance swimming, long distance running, Tour de France. No, not even Tour de France, because there's variations in intensity in Tour de France which require a lot more carbohydrates, and they get rest between the days and that sort of thing. So carbohydrate load, if we're gonna just take an ISSN approach, I've rendered this down to an equation, as you would normally expect. Anywhere between 0.5 and 1 gram of fat, depending on your tolerance and depending on how much you need for your endocrinology, just like Ashton suggested. For your protein, it's anywhere between 1 and 2 grams per kg of body mass. There is probably some arguments to push the protein beyond 2 grams per kg of body mass if you're in a deficit and you're trying to recomp, but usually I'm not so. I mean, that it does make sense if you're cutting, but like other than that, probably not much point. And then with carbohydrates, it's 1 to 3 grams per hour per kg of body mass.
Okay, so that's related to use of the carbohydrates.
Yeah, so depending on the intensity, you can increase or decrease the amount of carbohydrates per the hour of activity.
Interesting.
So if you're going with, let's say what your standard was, which is 2 grams per kg of body mass.
Yeah, that's like a minimum.
Minimum on the day, right? We're dealing with what would typically be strength training for an hour of training, right? I mean, an hour and a half of training of 2 grams per kg of body mass is probably going to be enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if the training starts pushing out further than that, then, or they're planning on growing, we can push up the carbohydrates even more.
Yeah, I feel like intra-performance is probably that. Like, you need a certain amount, and the minimum across the day for performance in that one training session is probably 2.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's for intra-workout performance. And I'm actually a huge fan of, even though your intra-workout performance is covered, total carbohydrate load. So I'm of the perspective, insulin is awesome for building muscle. What do those top bodybuilders do? Like, what's that last step that they go on, right? Maybe that will just give you a bit of a hint. And so what happens is when you increase total carbohydrate, you increase total insulin load, and insulin directly changes how proteins are expressed in cells.
Yeah, I mean, insulin is the most anabolic hormone we have.
Yeah.
Right? So people might seem to think that testosterone drives all the growth, but really, in reality, insulin is what does it. I mean, if you look at people who are overweight or obese, they're extremely anabolic in the wrong places, and it's largely to do with insulin. Insulin is driving the partitioning of nutrients into the fat cells. So if we can get that insulin to push nutrients in the right place, you can get some pretty severe growth.
Yeah. You can change the partitioning ratio of where insulin binds to by increasing the sensitivity in muscle cells. How do you do that? Training. Resistance training
and fasting. But like, you don't want to fast because you want to grow, right? So then there's a sort of balancing act there.
That's right.
Now, I think we had a discussion once about time restricted eating and how possibly there could be an argument, and this is a hypothetical, there could be an argument for restricting food intake to a particular window to increase the sensitivity to insulin in terms of the amount of carbohydrates you eat.
Yeah.
That research hasn't been done, guys. So but we do know that if you restrict your food to a 9-hour window, right, or I would say 9 hours, there is as much muscle growth as someone who doesn't.
Okay.
So
wow, that's interesting.
So you don't need to eat over like a 12-hour window in order to get the growth. And I need to re-look at that paper, and I don't know how trained these individuals are.
That was my question: are these beginners because they respond by just touching the bar? You know, so
so
I was
we
below the recommended protein intakes that we've suggested when I first started lifting, and I made phenomenal progress. So it's beginners are an interesting breed, that's for sure.
I mean, we could talk about Nat even. Nat was like not eating any protein and like still blew up, and then now he's eating protein, and it's like almost like questioning whether he's like natural or not, because he like increased his protein intake, right?
It's funny when you take those steps, right? And I reckon the next path for him is if he managed his carbohydrates closely and then his meal frequency and everything. Oh man, he's got like national record holder in 105s for sure. Yeah,
for sure. Anyway, that's something.
Yeah,
that was a bit of a segue anyway.
It was. But yeah, so total carbohydrate load is important. It'd also be interesting to discuss the different types of carbohydrates, because they don't all do the same thing. They all end up as glucose eventually, but they have different pathways to get there, right? So you have fructose is particularly binding to the liver.
Well, in terms of how we metabolize glucose, we can turn it into fructose rather.
Yeah.
How we metabolize fructose, we can either turn it into glycogen, like directly through a pathway which is similar to what we do with alcohol.
Yeah.
And then the other pathway is for us to turn glucose into, fructose into glucose rather.
Yeah.
So that goes into the bloodstream. So fructose never really goes straight into the bloodstream. It does. Yeah. I mean, but usually your liver wants to process it and turn it into what it wants to be.
Okay.
And so what Ashton's kind of suggesting is like a combination of different monosaccharides or different sugars are going to be utilized slightly differently, and then a ratio of these sugars might be useful for performance and maybe something to consider in terms of health.
Yeah.
So where did you want to take that?
Yeah, well, I think that there's an argument to be made that the quicker you can fill up your glycogen stores, the more you can initiate anabolism and change protein expression and build more muscle. There is some potential, a lot of these longevity guys love this, for fructose to be concerning for the liver. So because the liver
they also think it's concerning for other tissues in the body too.
Yeah.
But there's more evidence for just the liver. But do you want to explain that?
I'll try. I'm not an expert. This is something that I've kind of was thinking about and then talking to John about, is that because the liver wants to take up the fructose, when you fill glycogen, so let's say you fill the glycogen in the liver, and then what's going to happen is what are you going to do? You're going to start converting that extra energy into fat. And so if you consume a lot of fructose, potentially you're filling up you're localizing a lot of glycogen in the liver, and then therefore increasing the adiposity localized to the liver. So that's where you get things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Maybe not. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it depends on how much utilization of glycogen you get from the liver and daily activities. Often the sugar in the liver is used to facilitate functions of the liver, and sometimes we use the liver for, exercise, and like if you're
regulates the blood. It regulates your blood glucose, right?
It regulates blood glucose, and blood glucose will drop when you start using peripheral muscles, right?
Yeah.
So the muscles, when they deplete their glycogen, then that's going to tap into the muscle eventually from the liver.
Yeah.
But let's say you don't tap into it and it's overflowing, then fructose is readily turned into fat, and this is this thing called de novo lipogenesis.
Okay.
Where you're de novo new fat from another source, right?
Nice.
Lipogenesis is the creation of fat.
Yeah.
So that there typically will end up stored in the liver, right? So you get that
non-fatty, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Yeah, which is like deposits of fat in the liver, and that decreases the function of the liver, and obviously it's not very good for you, and then probably contribute to insulin resistance and blah 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 blah. But I don't know how much fructose that means. Is it just eating too much food? Is it just not enough activity? And is there something specific about fructose which makes that more likely?
Mm-hmm.
for it to happen. We do know if you have excess food, your fructose does start getting turned into fat. But the thing that came first was you eating too much food, not the fact that you were having fructose.
Exactly. And
So,
if you're driving a surplus with resistance training and sufficient protein, how much, like it's more likely that that surplus is going to contribute to muscle gain, and that can improve health in some cases.
And then how long are you going to be in that surplus, right? So being in a surplus obviously is probably is going to be stressful for your body because it has to deal with more nutrients that it's used to dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
But stress is necessary for you to adapt, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just about how long is your bulk.
Yeah.
Right.
And then what are the...
How dirty is your bulk?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we... Like, what are the markers that we would use to determine if our bulk has gone too far for health? Because, like, you see a lot of these top bodybuilders, they never come off the drugs. They're always pushing food. Like, their maintenance, like, their cooling off period, they're still on, like, super physiological test, And so they're always pushing the boundaries, and that's not going to be very good for your health.
No, definitely not. But then, I mean, some of that is also the drugs. Right?
Yeah. But in the case of naturals who want to take their performance to the next level, it's like, where do you stop? Like, it's the thing with naturals is like, you can only gain so much muscle, and it's actually probably because you don't have anabolic assistance, you probably don't want to get too fat when you're bulking anyway, because then you reduce one of your only ways of producing anabolism, and that's your insulin sensitivity, and you're going to then affect your endocrines because you have too much fat.
And that's why they typically suggest not pushing beyond 20% body fat with I've heard that some of the leading,
natty guys,
one of the natty scientists,
mm-hmm.
I'd like to say Eric Helms says this.
But
I don't know.
Yeah.
We need to go listen to some of his podcasts. But pushing beyond 20% body fat is probably not going to be conducive to gaining muscle tissue.
Yeah.
It'll probably just be conducive to making more fat.
Yeah, because as you increase body fat, you decrease insulin sensitivity.
Exactly.
Due to the increase in inflammatory cytokines?
Yeah.
Cool.
And that makes the tissues less sensitive because your body thinks this is an inflamed state because it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. There you go.
That's definitely part of it. There's probably other mechanisms as well, but that's definitely one of them.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, it's like, it seems like perhaps carbohydrates aren't necessarily the devil, but in situations where carbohydrates can result in overeating and then excess adiposity, that's when we start to see health detriments.
Yeah,
and when you're pushing performance, maybe in some situations you just got to keep eating. Yeah. There are some cases. So, tying back into that first part about the differences between health and performance, I thought it would be important to mention that sometimes you do have to push those carbohydrates to take it to that next level, and that's when health can get a little bit iffy.
Yeah,
so.
and carbohydrates become a trade-off, right? Because like with endurance runners or even in the endurance sports, that you can induce type 2 diabetes because you've been sitting in a surplus.
Yeah.
Right, because they have to be, because they're training in those sorts of loads and stuff.
Yeah.
Now, whether that came from the carbohydrates, I don't think so, because I'm pretty sure that that model has been debunked, that carbohydrates drive type 2 diabetes, but being in a surplus itself is probably what is contributing to that type 2 diabetes, and also probably some other nutrients that they might be eating.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you drove a surplus between a high fat environment, and a high carbohydrate environment, you may actually end up better with the high carbohydrate environment due to how that influences insulin. It's just when we tie back to that first podcast when we talked about the body composition model of health. Yeah. If you kind of stay within those ranges, you're pretty okay.
Well, I mean, that's interesting that you say that. I think there have been cases where their body comp is really good, but they still get type 2 diabetes because they've been in a surplus.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And we can have a look at some of Tim Noakes stuff. We can talk about that another time.
Yeah.
And delve into that. But there is the possibility for you to damage your health metabolically, but I think that only really happens with endurance athletes.
Okay.
And I don't know how much of that is abuse of other supplements, right?
I see what you're saying.
EPO and other things. So
drugs, basically.
Yeah. So drugs. It's tricky when you're walking. when you're getting data and you don't know how true what people were, or how true the statements that people are saying to you, right?
Yeah.
Like this person got type 2 diabetes, or this person got cardiovascular disease, and they look absolutely ripped, and it's like, well, did they take drugs?
Yeah.
So
that's right.
Yeah.
Because you can completely manipulate your body. And it's like, let's do a study on Chinese weightlifters. And then it's like, what does this have an effect on? It's like, well, what else were they doing that we don't know of? I'm not sure.
Gene splicing, maybe. For goodness sakes, they probably do everything. But
yeah, everything but train better. So, that was a joke. I'm sure they train. I'm going to get killed one day.
They train amazing, but yeah. There's definitely other things that they're doing. Anyway.
So in regards to protein, we talk about eating too much protein where you literally can't live.
Yeah,
is
that's
there
called
a point?
Rabbit starvation.
Rabbit starvation. Yeah, that's the term. Is that because like when rabbits eat like just lettuce, they just die?
No, it's because if a human only eats rabbits, they die.
Oh, okay. I thought it was some correlation with lettuce for some reason.
No. I mean, if you only eat lettuce, you definitely will die. But like, it's from people only eating rabbits, and then they die. Yeah, because they're too lean.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. So in regards to consuming too much protein, are there potential implications for health?
Yes.
And in what regards?
Yeah. So there is some longevity research suggesting that higher rates of mTOR lead to shorter length of life, and also higher rates of cancer.
Yeah.
So mTOR is inversely correlated with length of life.
Yeah.
So if you're stimulating mTOR through higher protein intakes, particularly leucine, the amino acid, it's theorized that you are going to damage your health. However, on the flip side of that, we also see that people who have less protein or less muscle tissue have lower lengths of life as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and then also more frailty because they don't have as much muscle tissue. So I think we have to take that longevity research with a grain of salt because, first of all, longevity research hasn't been done on humans.
So it hasn't been done on humans?
Well, how can it be? You can't monitor a human throughout their whole life.
That's a good point. That's a big grain of salt, actually.
That's a big grain of salt. It's all been done on rodents and
other animals.
And flies.
Flies.
And
worms.
C. elegans and fruit flies.
I mean, I don't know about you, John, but I don't have worm heritage relatively close. So
you do share the genes of fruit flies, but you don't have the heritage of fruit fly. You also share the genes with the rodents, but
I might look like a rat, but I'm not a rat.
Yeah,
so.
and that's the interesting thing, right? They're looking at certain nutrients, and the metabolism of macronutrients is even different between rodents and humans, even though we're both mammals. And they're extremely nocturnal, right? When I say extremely, they are nocturnal. We're not.
Yeah.
So
maybe on enough Adderall, but
but there are obviously quite big differences between those, and I think we'll wait and see before you start limiting your protein because you think you're going to live longer because of it. Maybe just hold off a little bit. Maybe if you know that you've just got cancer, maybe you can tailor back.
Drop the protein a little bit.
Protein if you know that the protein it's sensitive to mTOR signaling, right? You can talk to your doctor about that.
But then again, there was some interesting research where they were giving anabolics to cancer patients to reduce the associated loss of muscle mass. What do anabolics do? They upregulate mTOR. I just got to think, I saw a study, I have a vegan relative, about a couple of years ago, was trying to basically make the argument that meat is bad because meat is associated with higher IGF-1. And then I go, what else is associated with higher IGF-1? It's like puberty. It's like you hit puberty, growth hormone shoots through the roof, and then IGF-1 does. So I just think we have to realize that there's an acceptable range for health, right? And once we exceed those ranges, that's when things get iffy. Of course, if you're a bodybuilder and you're pushing mTOR through the roof for particular reasons, particularly enhanced bodybuilders, you're going to see some issues. And if you don't eat any protein, you're going to have other issues.
Yeah, I mean, with the bodybuilders, in defense of people who have high protein diets, they're driving the growth of tissue, muscle tissue, and the heart is a muscle, and that's usually what conks out because there's just too much muscle tissue.
Okay.
And then then they have heart attacks because there's no room to move.
Yeah.
With the
wow,
heart.
interesting.
Like
so,
that. I mean, I swear that's a big part of it, right?
Of course. Well, there's huge cardiovascular disease in bodybuilding.
Yeah, and I think it's probably. I mean, obviously, a lot of them are neurotoxic, and they do contribute to increases in blood pressure and that sort of thing. But a lot of that might be to do with the constriction of the vasculature and that.
Interesting.
Anyway, so we could delve into that, but that's not driven by the protein intakes that they have.
It's not.
It's driven by the drugs that they're taking.
Exactly. So yeah, big grain of salt, but generally protein, it's probably difficult to have too much. And even with the research on kidney function, it's very clear that the protein intake is not going to be negatively impacting your kidney function.
And it does depend on where you're getting your protein sources from. So certain proteins are gonna beef is going to be a great source, or sources which are like easier to digest and not affecting your gut are going to have a better effect on your body, and your kidney is going to be able to process better because it's more balanced for you. But yeah, I think that's something for us to discuss in greater detail another time when we talk about amino acid ratios and profiles and that. Yeah, because that's pretty nitty gritty.
I'm actually not too familiar with that stuff, so I have to have you on for that. Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, because I mean, depending on what your foods come in, like the balance between certain types of amino acids might be important for acidity of the blood and that sort of thing. But typically if you increase protein, it doesn't affect even people with kidney disease. So why would it be something we should worry about for
in a healthy population, especially? Yeah. So it's like potentially, maybe issues with mTOR later in life, but I think it's iffy, and we need to look at that further. In regards to fats and health, so there's different types of fats. We have saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and it's proposed a lot of different reasons for health and performance and all that kind of stuff. So with endurance runners, you got the short chain fatty acids are going to be potentially more readily available for endurance runners, from my understanding.
Yes, but like, where do you get lots of short chain fatty acids? Like, how are you going to drink acetic acid? Are you going to drink vinegar? Like, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I guess, it's not discussion. Readily available in our food, so typically where people are going to be getting it from is like from longer chain fatty acids. Yes, short chain fatty acids is going to be better for us to utilize energy, but there's probably an argument for medium chain triglycerides because they're going to be more readily available for energy output. We know that if a saturated fat is shorter than 10 or shorter than 11, I think it's 10 to 11 carbons in length, it ends up getting processed by the liver, so it doesn't even go through the same mechanisms as you would when you get longer chain fatty acids, which is pretty interesting. And so it's more readily available for you to do during exercise. However, you need to have the machinery to digest it. Yeah. So if you have too much fat and you don't have the machinery to digest it, where does it go?
Well, it's just going on fat tissue.
No, it doesn't even get absorbed.
Oh, it's just straight up a...
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then you get fat in your feces, and that's not very comfortable. So,
that wouldn't be very comfortable. So in regards to performance and
it's
fats, it's a bit just get your body's requirements, basically.
It's probably get your body's requirements, make sure you have it with protein so you can actually absorb, or have it with something that slows down the transit time so you can absorb it. And people are going to have certain tolerances to amount of fat that they can eat.
In regards to just general health?
General health, and also in terms of their insulin sensitivity. If their insulin sensitivity is not that good, then they're probably more likely to store it in fat and that sort of thing. So it's definitely a balancing act with fat, and it's going to be very variable between the individual. Unfortunately. There's no hard and fast rule. I mean, 1 gram per kg of body mass is probably a good starting point. You might need to go down, you might need to go up, depending on how much carbohydrate you eat. Okay. How much of that fat is saturated in mono and polyunsaturated fat is another discussion as well.
For performance and health and...
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm going to advocate, if you've ever had a conversation with me, I'm going to advocate for increases in saturated fat.
Which now I do.
Because it's the backbone for us to produce cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that saturated fat will boost the transport of cholesterol. That's actually why I'm taking it.
Yeah.
Or that's why I'm suggesting people eat it. It probably will increase your LDL, but it's probably going to increase your HDL too. So in terms of health, it should be fairly neutral. Saturated fat does not oxidize because it has no double bonds.
Yeah.
So it's not going to have it's not going to increase the oxidative damage on your body. Contrary to popular belief, unfortunately, that's been slammed for a long time.
And the oxidative stress is a problem when we look at LDL particles, because once you take those smaller LDL particles, if you oxidize them, that's when they stay around in your bloodstream and clot arteries, from my understanding.
Yeah, so oxidized LDL is obviously not very good for you, and it is correlated with increased cardiovascular disease and plaques. So and there's been confounding understandings with saturated fat elevating LDL, but I don't know, talking about this like over a podcast is pretty hard without drawing a picture. So
and we've only got so much time to we could literally talk about saturated fat for like good 3 hours.
Yeah, I suggest that people increase their saturated fat to a decent amount of their total fat in order to make sure that their hormone profile is stable. Your mono and your polyunsaturated fatty acids are going to be used for other functions.
Yeah. But it's very minor, and if you were to choose between monos and polys, you're probably going to want more mono because there's less chance of oxidation.
Yes, correct. Yeah, and there's less chance of oxidation, and it's less likely to affect your prostaglandin function and that sort of thing. So
okay, cool. Yeah, so that's been an awesome conversation. Let's quickly touch on sleep. So people, I hear oftentimes people are like, I'm going to sacrifice my sleep to train.
Yeah.
Obviously, training is good for health. Sleep is good for health. In the short term and potentially long term, what is the most important? Like, if you were to sacrifice one, which one would it be? Like, in a short term situation, would you, if someone said, I'm not going to train, no, I am going to train and sacrifice my sleep, what are your thoughts on that in regards to health?
I think sleep should come first.
Should come first?
Yes, unfortunately.
Unfortunately?
Like, I obviously like training more than I like sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
But sleeping is important for all functions.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, you are going to be walking around, I hope, during the day. There is going to be some physical activity.
Yeah.
You training is a top-up on that.
Okay.
Right? Sleep is going to help you recover. It's going to help you consolidate your learning. It's going to help you with your body composition. It's going to help you with your health. And we see with people who sleep less have less or worse outcomes in terms of health across the board, or cause mortality. So make sure you get your sleep first. If you're finding that you have to sacrifice sleep for training, you need to find another training time.
Yeah.
like it's not like
and even for athletes, it's like, and it's especially because athletes are juggling as much performance as they can. One bad night of sleep actually multiplies the bad effect.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, God, I miss out on an extra hour of sleep, and now my top set today is going to feel like shit.
Yeah.
I'm going to feel like shit. And then now I've pushed my circadian rhythm a little bit forward because I went to bed late and then I woke up slightly later, but I still got less than 7. It's just a mind bubble. I think about my sleep like all the time because I'm just making sure I get that 8 hours.
Yeah, you wanna create the same period of time as your sleep window to sustain the circadian rhythm. So you pretty much have to decide what time slot you are going to sleep. This would to maximize your performance and also to maximize your health. This is the funny thing. This is where it completely lines up. You decide when you go to sleep and when you wake up, and you don't change that. You never change it unless you have to fly overseas. Yeah. Like, that's like the rule. So let's say you need 8.5 hours. You go to bed at 9:30. You wake up at 6. That's it. Bang.
Yeah.
That's it. You don't deviate. In an ideal world. And the people who live the longest, like in terms of longevity, it's the consistency of sleep and eating patterns that pretty much dictate it.
Wow.
So they go to bed at the same time, they wake up at the same time, and they eat the same time during the day. They don't even change their breakfast time or whatever. Like their rhythm is like so in tune that there's no deviation.
It's funny how we're creatures of habits like that.
Yeah, and if you contribute to the habit, you increase your health. But maybe not more importantly, but more importantly for some young cunts, you got to improve your performance if you find that rhythm.
Yeah, that's right. It's like train hard, brother. Sleep through the week. It's like actually the really strong ones are sleeping.
Yeah, they
sleeps
sleep
for
more.
the strong. You know.
Sleeps for the strong. That's true.
Awesome. I think that wraps up this podcast. Oh, it's actually an awesome episode.
Yeah.
I actually learned a little bit.
Oh, you learned a bit. That's cool. That was fun.
At least 1% of my knowledge base has increased. So I'm just talking crap now. I actually learned quite a lot, and that was a really cool discussion.
I know we sort of rushed the end of it, and maybe we can expand on that another time. I think it's quite a cool topic, talking about health and performance. In some cases, like they're almost split, right? There's a dichotomy, but then in some places like sleep, they're actually completely in line.
Yeah,
which is really cool. It's very interesting, and I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on to the podcast. I really appreciate it. That's been episode 9, and we will see you for episode 8, and we'll see you for episode 9. Cool. Where can we find you really quick?
You guys can follow me on 2 Dudes 1 Barbell, and you can please follow me on Instagram. Coach.JohnBlack. You can ask me questions if you want. I'm willing to answer.
Awesome.
Cool.
Sounds good. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.